Test.
Hey, we're on.
All right.
All right, it's time to get started.
Good evening, everybody.
We have a really low number tonight, so everybody speak up. I think we have a lot of people out of town and a lot of stuff going on with that. So appreciate Jonathan being willing to step in, and we got one more week after tonight, and then summer series starts 2 weeks from tonight.
Yeah, looking forward to that. It's exciting.
With Trey Haskett is going to be here from Tupelo, Mississippi, talking about Jehovah and Elohim, the names for God used in the Old Testament. He's excited about that. He was my roommate last week, and so we talked quite a bit about that. So I'm looking forward to y'all meeting Trey.
He's a good guy.
Great guy. We've got, we're in Ecclesiastes 10 about verse 11. And Jared has a mic, so I'm going to ask him to lead us in prayer, and then we'll get started. You may have ended up with a mic that doesn't work. I don't know. We had one that didn't work Sunday. Oh, that one does work.
Swap out here.
Here, we'll put this to the side and we'll take care of that later. Okay, I had a weird break here. I don't know what I was thinking when I did this, but we're in verse 11, which is actually the end of a section, verse 8 through 11, of these four different people who are doing their jobs but getting injured. So I know that was talked about last week, but the one who digs a pit falls into it and is bitten by a snake. The one quarrying stones or splits logs is hurt and endangered. The iron is blunt, does not sharpen the edge. And then verse 11, if the serpent bites before it is charmed, there's no advantage to the charmer. Jonathan, thoughts on that? That's so easy, I'll toss it to my co-teacher.
Yeah. As I mentioned to Terry, when I first read through this, I'm like, what sort of rambling did I get into and agree to teach to tonight? One thing in kind of looking through this that there may be a little bit difference in translation for this, that, ESV reads, if the serpent bites before it is charmed, there is no advantage. I think a lot of it says, there's some argument that the translation should be, then there is no advantage to the charmer. And different ideas on what that could be, but part of the idea is that I think once the damage is done, there's no going back. When you look at a snake charmer, what do you think of when you think of a snake charmer? Is that something, let me ask you this, is that charming a snake something you want to try to do? Me either. It takes skill, right? It takes somebody who knows what they're doing.
That's debatable. I think it takes stupidity myself.
Stupidity, I would tend to agree with that. And it's interesting that in the very next verse that we start talking about the words of a fool. And I think if we kind of put those together, that you're talking about somebody maybe boasting of doing more than they're able to do, being overconfident in their abilities, and really getting ahead of themselves, kind of putting their foot in their mouth, so to speak. That if I were to try to charm a serpent, more than likely I'm going to get bit. So if I'm running my mouth telling you I can do this, I can't. And just like those who dig a pit and fall into it, I'm setting myself up for failure when I do that.
Yeah, I think it has to be attached to those three previous verses, and here's why, is because if you think of this in the level or the area of having a skill, the snake charmer kind of wraps all those up. All those show that with every skill, there's risk. Even those who are experts are encountering risk in what they do, whether that's somebody who's, quarrying rock or somebody who is cutting down wood or digging a pit. There's an inherent risk in all of those things, even for the expert. And the idea here is I think, if you don't use your skill in whatever you're doing, you magnify that risk, and the skill is no good after the fact. So in the idea of a snake charmer, it does no good to be a snake charmer once you're already bitten. You have to use your talents and abilities before getting bit, or there's no value to them. And so the idea there may be of everything has inherent risk in it, but you still apply your wisdom in the situation to the best of your ability to avoid the greatest risk. Failing to do that almost ensures the greatest risk, like the snake charmer who doesn't bother charming the snake until he's already bitten. It is foolishness. And I do think this has to be kind of couched in the context of wisdom versus folly, such as what we see here, starting here in a few verses. And also at the beginning of chapter 10, there was wisdom versus folly. So here's a little section talking about how one uses their wisdom to avoid the danger that is there. I agree there's some ambiguity with the translation, but I think that understanding applies either way, which is also another reason why I think it's a good understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, one of the commentators had mentioned, the skill is useless unless it's applied correctly.
Right.
So I may know how to drive a car, but if I don't turn away from the wall that's in front of me, knowing how to drive that car doesn't do any good.
Right. Right. And that seems to be the idea here. He's then going to go back to wisdom and folly in verse 12, where the words of a wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. There's, again, some ambiguity here. By the way, we've said this before. I think it's important to remind ourselves of this. The New Testament, when it comes to translation, is pretty certain. There's just so much Greek out there in manuscript form to help us understand. But Hebrew is just not the same. It is a much more difficult language. A lot of times you find yourself translating the Old Testament or helping the Hebrew text be translated by the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament. That sometimes helps us understand more. So just kind of really important to kind of remind us of that. And so it may feel like we're constantly saying, well, this text is hard to do. And some of these, the thing that helps us even more than the Septuagint is these parallel phrases and understanding what, from a Hebrew poetry standpoint, what may be the attempt to say. And so that's really important. So here is this contrast of the wise man's words versus the foolish man's words, or mouth versus lips. And what's the difference here? How do the wise man's words, what do? Okay, they win him favor. They gain him some kind of reward. They benefit him, if you will. And then on the other side, what do we have? We have the lips of a fool that do what? Consume him. The idea here, by the way, is really the idea of engulfing him, which is fairly interesting. How does a wise man's words consume him? What does that mean?
The foolish man.
I mean the foolish man, sorry.
Yeah.
Foolish man.
It's almost like talking to be talking, but to the point where no one is listening, but the wise man chooses his words and doesn't, not always have to have so many to, commands that respect.
Okay.
That's just,
So the wise man just keeps on, and I think that will magnify as we go on.
Yeah. Have you ever known someone who talks himself into a hole? They just keep going and going further and further away from truth or reality. Yeah, I think that's kind of the idea here, that the foolish man, there's no sense to it. He just keeps, empty words keep coming out of the mouth.
Right. And verse 13 is bridged to verse 12. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. So we have a commentary off of 12b with 13. And it kind of goes to what Lori was saying, how it's just words upon words, right? The beginning is foolishness, and the end is madness. So, and I think there's an intentional escalation between those two things. At the beginning of talking yourself into a hole, you just sound like a fool. By the time it's over and you've dug it so deep, and everybody around you is like, why didn't you stop? Yeah.
Right. And I think part of the idea too is they don't learn from that. You do it over and over and over, that there's no progression away from foolishness at any point.
Right. So there's a possibility that 14 is kind of starting the bookend. A fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him. So here is this continual words upon words. But now it's tied to what? What's his words in relation to? What's that? What? His ending? Okay. The future as a whole. Anything in the future. The fool has many words about the future, and he's not going to listen to anybody tell him any differently than what the future is. And I think part of that is his ending. Now, think about what this whole book has been about. What's it been about? It's been about life being meaningless, but why, ultimately?
I think what I read. So, it doesn't matter if you pursue wisdom or riches or pleasure, it all ends in death.
Right, it's the ending. He talks about a lot of stuff, but the real driving point is the ending of man. That's how it starts off, with the sun rising and going down and racing back, and generation after generation coming, and nobody remembers you. This endless cycle of life. He notices the whole idea that life is meaningless is built upon the idea that death, with just looking at life under the sun, death is all you have to look forward to. Regardless of what you have, regardless of what you do, all that is out there is death, and therefore it's meaningless. And it's pretty interesting when you think of it in those terms, that he's saying, and I don't know quite, I don't think he's talking about himself. It's as if he's talking to anybody who disagrees with him a little bit, it feels like, in my mind. I don't know what you think there.
Yeah, he's making, over and over, he's making that same argument, to your point, as if he's trying to convince someone. Especially reading verse 14, it feels like it is particularly timely for us right now. What do we have going on from a political standpoint? Anybody get on social media? You get on Facebook, on Twitter, any of that? What? So much of that is what? Fools multiplying words, trying to predict the future.
Yep.
Just a waste of time. And that's nothing's changed to the point of the book. Nothing changes. We're dealing with the same thing 3,000 years later.
Right. Yeah. And then the next verse, the toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. Now, this is an accusation. And what is he saying here? You understand what he's saying here? The previous verses were about what?
Running your mouth.
His words, his speech.
Yeah.
What is this about?
he doesn't even know his way around, hardly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's about his actions. It's about, yeah, his labor wearies him, but then also this idea, he doesn't even know how to find his way home, is the other aspect of what's being said here. And it's really about ability now, not just speaking, it's his actions, his awareness, and his ability. So we've escalated beyond just the rash words of a fool, and now we're looking at his behavior as a whole. And so he's had this lengthy section, really from 10 verse 1 all the way through verse 15, focusing on wisdom versus folly. And it's interesting because what he's pursuing is wisdom in regards to life. And so as he begins to, what you're seeing here is he begins to wind things up, he starts kind of focusing on this wisdom versus folly idea. Before he gets into the king thing here in a moment.
He switches gears a little bit there. One writer kind of alluded to 2 Timothy, I believe it was chapter 3 and verse 7, always learning but never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. And that's kind of what we see here, that the fool has a lot going on, uses a lot of words, does a little bit of work, but never gains anything from any of it. They never have an eye for improving or learning or growing, doing better for themselves.
Right. Any questions, comments about that? Yeah.
The irony to me is the author of this and his impression is an example of the fool who keeps running his mouth, and as Jared has said over and over, how many times he says the same thing over and over and over. So it's interesting that he is this fool.
I think to a large degree he is, yes. Although he will reach a wise conclusion here pretty soon.
But he says the same thing over and over and over. What does he say right here? A fool multiplies his words.
Yeah. It is interesting, and I was talking with a friend the other day about Ecclesiastes, how while he says ultimately the same thing over and over again, you see with each cycle a little bit more perspective towards God added in each of those cycles. Starts with not much, and then he adds a little bit. But ultimately, it ends up being the same thing over and over. We call it one time Groundhog's Day.
Right.
That's exactly what it feels like.
And he makes the point in a little bit different manner each time, which if you're arguing with a fool, which we know how that goes, but that's what you have to do, right? You ever argue with somebody who just cannot see your point? What do you have to do? Change your approach, say it a different way. And it's almost as if that's what he's doing here.
It is, except for it feels like he's doing that with himself. I mean, I think when I read this sometimes, I feel like he's both the wise and the fool arguing with himself along the way, because he gets close and then he talks himself out of it almost. And that's what's most interesting to me is it's almost like a dual personality thing at times, it feels like, as you go through here. Well, let's switch to ruling in nations and kings. And woe to you, O land, when your king is a child and your princes feast in the morning. Now, what does that mean? I mean, I think it's interesting, this woe about a king being a child based on the history of God's people. I mean, one of the better kings was a child, right? If you go look at the chart, one of the few smiley faces was an 8-year-old. So, what's he saying here? What does he mean by your king being a child? Yeah, he's just immature. This is not about age. This is about maturity. And I think that's the key here. What about princes feasting in the morning?
They start partying as soon as they get up.
Yeah. Versus what is their responsibility to rule and to lead, right?
Right. It feels like the implication here is this is an inappropriate, riotous feasting. And it's certainly contrasted to the next verse, right? It either could be that they feast as soon as they get up, or they're still feasting from the night before when everybody else gets up. Either one is bad, by the way. And so this is a kingdom run amok. The king is immature. The second in command has no responsibility. They're more interested in the spoils of being next to the king than they are in helping the king. Now you contrast that to verse 17. Happy are you, O land, when your king is a son of the nobility, and your princes feast at the proper time for strength, not for drunkenness. And when we put those two verses together, we kind of get a really good picture of the differentiation here. One is a kingship where everything's, and it reminds me, by the way, if this is Solomon and you take Proverbs going to his son, if Ecclesiastes is intended for those who come after him, I couldn't help but think about Rehoboam myself, because the older, wiser counselors he pushed away for his friends who told him what he wanted to hear in order to enjoy the increase in taxes and the ability to party on Rehoboam's dime, for lack of a better, it's the implication there.
And he's called immature or childish.
He is called childish and immature. So it's just interesting to put that in that kind of context. And then to follow that with, through sloth, the roof sinks in, and through indolence, the house leaks. What does that mean? Yeah, I mean, he's using the illustration of a house. We've seen a house where they've not taken care of it before. I don't know. I'm not from here, so I don't know. But when I turn off of 69 onto 36 right there, there's a house where the roof is just sagging on the front. And somebody obviously owns that property, because there's vehicles moved around. They got an old fire truck and a camper. Stuff's moved around, but nobody's taking care of the house, right? And what's going to happen to that house eventually?
It's going to fall in.
It's going to fall in, right? And we've seen barns and houses and structures all do that. You don't take care of your house, and the roof's going to start to sag, and the water's going to leak in, and it's going to collapse on you. Now, I think this is a generic proverb, for lack of a better term, to everybody. Take care of what is yours. But following up the context of the kings and the princes, I think there's also an application here of, hey, when you have rulers like this, your kingdom is going to fall. It cannot stand in that way, which is fairly interesting.
Yeah. But, I mean, when we look at that, what is the primary concern or goal of these immature princes who feast? It's all about them, right? It's about having a good time. As we see in verse 17, he contrasts the good with the bad and refers to them as drunkards, basically. They have no concern for the kingdom. They have no concern for justice, for godliness, for any of the things that God has commanded them to be in charge of. And we see the result of that the kingdom will fall apart, quite literally fall apart. And we see that with Israel.
Yep. So then verse 19, bread is made for laughter, wine gladdens wife, and money answers everything. Here's where we get this, okay, I'm following you. Where did this come from? Right? Although, should this really surprise us? Because what does this sound like? What does this ultimately sound like he's done before?
Yeah.
Eat, drink, and be merry. That's what he said all along. And how does money figure into that? Because
You got to buy food and drink.
the only way to eat, drink, and be merry is if you have money. And remember, I think it was like chapter 7 or 8 where he talked about, if you labor with your hands and you have wealth, then use it to eat, drink, and be merry. But only a few God's given that ability to, and the rest, they're miserable when they try to do that, and he talks about himself in that sense. Well, here's the idea. See, at the end of the day, life has no meaning. So bread and wine is where it's at. You've got to have money for that. So money is the answer to all the problems because it provides the eat, drink, and be merry, which is really interesting.
Yeah, to kind of go back to talking about the foolish man in verse 15,
Yeah.
maybe not a direct connection there, but the foolish man doesn't work, doesn't earn the money. So in this context, it's only the wise who can enjoy life,
Right.
who have the means to have bread and wine and live this way.
And this is an odd interlude of some kind because we go back to the king after it. It's just very weird. It's like you said, it's like the ramblings of an old person. When you go in and they're talking about one thing and then they go over here and then they go back over here. That's kind of how it feels.
He criticizes the childish princes for eating and drinking and feasting,
Yep.
but he's not saying that enjoying life and sustaining yourself is wrong.
No, there's a proper time for
There's a
feasting.
proper time for that.
Right,
And that
in verse 17.
may be part of what he's saying here is use what you have appropriately.
Right.
Does that verse in any way, shape, or form be considered sarcastic at all? I mean, it's kind of random. He talks about, all the things like the foolishness of the king and how, you don't take care of things, it doesn't get into, hey, bread is made for laughter, and wine buys life, and money answers everything. Like, it's just so weird. It seems like he's just making fun. I don't know.
I mean, maybe I've not found a commentator that suggests that, and they're way smarter than I am on this. Usually when we see sarcasm, it's a little more clearer than this.
Did he use it earlier?
Not on this. That's the other thing is this has been a repetitive theme of eat, drink, and be merry. And that's not sarcasm. This seize the day carpe diem idea is, hey, life has no meaning, so go out and have a feast. And that's been his answer all along, has been, life is vain, go have a party, because there's nothing after this. And that's just been a repetitive answer. And it seems like the answer here, maybe, but it's hard to, based on the repetitive nature of this concept, it's hard to say it's being sarcasm here.
I mean, eat, drink, and be merry, but know what the result's going to be. Your house is going to fall down.
Yeah, maybe. Now, verse 20, even in your thoughts do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich. For the bird of the air will carry your voice, and some winged creature tell the matter. What does that mean? What's that? Not just the king, but the rich too. Now, it's interesting that the king is able to find out your thoughts, and the rich is able to find out what you say in the privacy of your room. And so the rich have abilities, but it's not the same abilities as the king, and that's intentional. This idea that the king can tell what you're thinking. And the bird of the air and some winged creature is really just the idea of, think about this idea of the fool. You run your mouth. My mom used to say, your sins will find you out. That's what she used to quote to us all the time. And that's the idea here, right?
Yeah. And the more you ramble, the more likely you are to say something you shouldn't say.
Right. Yeah.
Henry VIII is the prime example of this. When he was remodeling Hampton Court, the Royal Hall, he had kids with inquisitive looking faces carved into the eaves. And they were looking down on the courtiers. And the point was, you cannot say anything in this room that the king won't hear. And that's where the term eavesdropper comes from.
Wow.
So it's just, Henry VIII's not a role model by any means.
No, he's not up there on the role model list. No, he's up there with Charles Barkley on the not a role model list, for those of you that were alive back then. But yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk about bread on the water, which is another. Look, this is difficult. Cast your bread on the water, for you will find it after many days. How does that make sense? Your bread had to be tough? Maybe it was unleavened bread. I don't know. Does unleavened bread float?
Your actions will come back to haunt you, possibly. Your words and actions.
Oh, actions come back to haunt you? Maybe. Maybe. What? Good things come back? Okay. Anybody else? Reap what you sow. Okay. There is some thought this could be charity, and that's the most common interpretation of this, is that if you are charitable and you help others, that will come back to you. I'm not sure that's quite the intended original. And let me explain why. I think verse 2 and this, I think if you follow what I'm about to say through this section, it might make a little more sense than the charity aspect.
And I'll say some of the other versions read to ship your grain across the sea.
Right.
And after many days, you will receive a return, which feeds more into verse 2.
Correct. The idea here being that this is about trading by sea and investing, okay? That if you will then engage in trade, like putting your bread out across the water, what will come back to you is profit. Now, if you look at verse 2, if you take the charity aspect, the idea is, well, give to multiple people because you don't know what they're going to go through. But if you take this trade aspect to verse 2, it seems to make a lot more sense, which is, and let me say it this way, when you go invest in funds today, you're told not to invest in only one fund.
Diversify.
Diversify. And why should you diversify your funds? What's that? Right. Go back to the fool who can't predict what will happen tomorrow. If that was ever true, I think the market's probably one of those places, right?
Absolutely.
Diversify your funds because one may crash and another may really take off. Well, the idea here of trade with 7, maybe even 8 people, because you don't know what's going to happen on earth that will affect the trading and the profit you've done. And when you put all that together, and then you go to verse 3, where it's the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. A tree falls to the south or to the north, and the place where the tree falls, there it will be. Well, that statement related to this same idea is rain is inevitable, but there's also randomness of a tree falling. And so part of the idea is there are some things that are inevitably good, but randomness is going to happen, and you can't predict the randomness, right? It's going to rain somewhere, you know that, but you don't know where the tree falls and how it impacts your trade and your profit. And so, he who observes the wind will not sow, he who regards the clouds will not reap. If you wait as a farmer for the perfect conditions to sow your field, it's not going to happen. The joke in my wife's family was her dad loved to fish unless the girls wanted to go out on the lake. And then it was either too sunny or too cold or too windy or too cloudy. It was always too something. It was never the right day to go out on the lake because it had to be just perfect conditions. And they always joked about that. Well, it's the same idea with the farmer. If you're waiting for the perfect conditions, it's never going to happen because you can't predict everything. So put your bread on the water to 7 or 8 different people and wait for the profit to come back. Invest wisely. This is investment strategy, in other words, is what it is.
Yeah, and the other piece of it at the end of verse 1 is after many days. It can take a while.
Be patient.
Be patient.
Be patient. That was the other thing I had to teach my mom when she moved in with us. She would call every day to check on her mutual funds. No. That will drive you nuts, right? Because she'd hang up, well, I lost $800 today. Yeah, but tomorrow you may gain $900. Just don't call, right? Just wait. Play the long game. And that's the idea here. Be patient, right?
Because some will go up, some will go down.
Correct.
Some ventures will work, some will not. But the wise knows to, again, diversify and be patient.
Correct.
Do not expect to find investing advice in Ecclesiastes. There you go.
I don't know. All good advice comes from Scripture eventually, right?
Yeah.
So there you go. That just seems to me to make maybe clearer sense than the charity interpretation, which again is the predominant interpretation by a lot of people.
It's a good thought. I'm just not sure it's quite what the preacher was going for here.
Correct. Correct. Any questions or thoughts about any of that? Comments? Okay. Verse 5, as you do not know that the way of the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. See, does it feel like he's commenting on what all he just said? You don't know everything. You can't, and all the way back to the fool, right? You can't predict the future. God's going to, and again, they believe in the sovereignty of God in all areas. God's in control of everything good or bad at this time, right? And so from that standpoint, you have as much sense being able to tell what God's going to do as you do have sense predicting when a baby's going to be born. We still predict when babies are going to be born, and we're still wrong the majority of the time, correct? Isn't that what happens? And so it's pretty interesting from that regards. That's his illustration there.
Yeah. I mean, to that point, we don't know when a baby's going to be born, but we know it will be born.
Correct.
We don't know how the bones come together, but we know they do. So we don't have to have all the answers. God has provided what we need. We know enough.
Right.
We know what the outcome's going to be.
So then he kind of says in verse 6, so in the morning sow your seed, and in the evening withhold not your hand, for you don't know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. Just sow. Get out in your field and sow, and God will take care of the growth. But boy, that sounds like something, doesn't it? That sounds an awful lot like Corinthians. Paul planted, Apollos watered, God gave the increase. Just go sow, go water. God will take care of the growth. So now we have evangelism advice in Ecclesiastes.
Just do it.
Right. Just go out and do it. You can't predict what's going to happen. Go do it.
And there's, I think, a contrast, again, going back to our childish rulers, who, what did they do in the morning? They party.
They're partying in the morning.
Right.
And here wisdom is sowing in the morning.
Wisdom is sowing in the morning.
Working. Being productive. Verse 7, light is sweet and is pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. This is interesting because you remember when he said it would be better not to even be born? And the idea there that because life has no meaning and death is its end, it's just better never to see the sun. And now, well, light is sweet and it's pleasant to see the sun. There's some thought that he's shifting here towards the youth of verse 10. And that he's introducing this idea of light and the sun. And then verse 8, so if a person lives many years, let him rejoice in them, but let him remember the days of darkness will be many, and all that comes is vanity. So, rejoice, but darkness is coming and it's meaningless. Everything's meaningless. But go ahead and rejoice. It's pretty interesting kind of stuff. And that's kind of the end of where we plan to get tonight. Any thoughts about those last couple of verses, Jonathan?
Really not a lot to add to that. Just that contrast kind of sticks with me, that we have that light and the dark, which is really a theme through the Bible, which is fascinating as we look at it. But we will have dark times. We will have dark days, especially under the sun, but there is that light. There is a light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak.
Yeah, Wybray suggests here that he's not trying to darken things here. He's actually using death as the backbone of life to highlight the opportunities to rejoice. And I think that's the proper understanding here. Hey, remember and he even talks about later on to remember the Creator in the days of your youth before the evil days come. Dark days are going to come. There's going to be struggles. allow that to magnify the good days. Here's good advice for once, it seems, in these couple of verses, rather than maybe all the meaningless gloom and doom, vanity. Although he says everything's vain here again, I think there's a little bit of that before we get to that. Charlie?
Verse 7, light is sweet, but we had a term in the photographic industry, that there were certain times of the day when it was God's light.
Huh.
And that's what we wanted to get. We got an assignment that was during that period of time, we would look for God's light, which was this wonderful subdued light that's, y'all know what it is.
Well, I think the social media kids call that the golden hour, by the way.
Yeah.
That's what we call it today. My daughter back there shaking her head, yes. It's golden hour is a time to take your selfies. That's yeah.
Perfect, yeah.
Yeah. Scott?
Yeah, I was just thinking in the terms of vain, we've heard this over and over again from him. But the perspective that he's giving us now with this idea that, you know, hey, you gotta live. Don't be afraid to go out there and do. You gotta cast it out there. You gotta sow it. You gotta invest wisely. You gotta be charitable, whatever that.
Right.
You gotta do these things. And then ultimately, just remember, you know, enjoy the day, as he said, enjoy the day that you have. Because there's going to be dark. I understand the darkness, as we just said, filled, and ultimately all is vanity. In other words, all the things you're striving for in this life, you're out there doing, in the end, those things won't really matter except for the principle of what you did for God, ultimately.
Yeah, he's getting to that point, right?
He's getting closer to making that point.
And he's setting up, I think one of the things happening is this is the ramblings of an old man for young people. And he's getting ready to make that conclusion to the young people and tell them, and he's setting that up with, hey, you've got to keep living, you've got to keep working, you've got to keep enjoying life, even though you know that essentially at the end you're going to die. That's what's going to happen. But enjoy life while you can, and he's going to say, fear God. We'll get to that next week, to the conclusion.
And as we're getting to that, it's interesting to me that into this verse, he concludes this thought with all that comes as vanity. He kind of wraps up talking about darkness that will come, talking about vanity. And I'm reminded that even the darkness, the bad times, are empty. They don't matter if we continue with perspective that we're going to get to next week.
Right. And I do think there's a point to take from this. But if you just look at everything below the sun, it is meaningless. Now, how we live here is not, but the stuff below the sun and the life we're told to live, as far as the world views it, is meaningless. Last week we talked with some of the campers about how our value system is one thing, but God has completely flipped upside down the world's value system. That what man calls valuable, God doesn't see as valuable. And that's the idea that he's really getting at is, under the sun, they tell you this is what matters. I've done all of that. It doesn't matter. This stuff doesn't have any meaning. If you have as many relationships and money and success and feasting and partying and all of those things, at the end of the day, it's going to leave you empty and without meaning in your life. That's what he's saying. And to get back to what we said a couple times, this is what life is like for people without God. There's no value there. There's no meaning to it. If all you have to live for is your portfolio in the flesh and the things of this earth, that's a meaningless life. And you can be successful by the world's standards, wildly successful, and you're going to feel empty and miserable at the end of your life. And that's what the idea here is. We're out of time. Great discussion tonight. Look forward to next week. Thanks.